let's be real. Break it down, heal and rebuild. Submit to God's will till destiny's fulfilled. Be a rebel like Jesus was. Do it how Jesus does. Cast aside empty tradition and learn to lead with love.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. Thank you for tuning in to another Dr. Murder Minute on this Friday evening as we continue to examine Destiny Focus, Destiny Unveiled, which is our theme for 2025. And our current series, as we look at Destiny Focus and Destiny Unveiled, is Connected Destiny. And so on this evening, we continue looking at the connected destiny of Jonathan and David. So as you come in, let us center ourselves and remember to like, comment, and share. Like, comment, and share. And again, I want to thank you for tuning in. During our last gathering, when we looked at the connected destiny between Jonathan and David, we were able to examine 7 key themes, which was God's providence, destiny helpers, connected destiny, love and support, purpose, prophecy, and friendship were all named during our last gathering. And so we focused last time on God's providence and destiny helpers. And on this evening, we will focus on connected destiny and love and support, right? So this evening, we will focus on connected destiny, love, and support. Remember to put your comments in the chat. Put your comments in the chat and like, share, and subscribe. And so this evening, I want to do a quick recap and just go over a little bit about what we spoke about during our last gathering. So we talked about not just the 7 themes, or we learned of the 7 key themes that I was able to find as I studied 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 1, focusing on that, but also how I was able to see these themes when I studied 1 Samuel, looking at chapters 13 to 24. But our key text came from 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. So as we gather ourselves and gather our thoughts, let us just cast aside every weight, cast aside every distraction, and cast aside and lay aside every burden to God. So no matter what you're facing on this evening, know that we serve a God who is active, a God who is present, a God who hears, and a God who has the capacity to hold, to heal, to deliver, to set free, to show us compassion, right? To be able to provide us with an unconditional love and the support that we need, no matter what we may be facing during this time. So no matter what it looks like when you turn on the news, no matter what it looks like when you turn on the radio, just know that we serve a God who is able and who is still speaking and who has all power. So with that being said, let us clear our minds and our hearts and go to the throne of grace. God, we thank you as we gather into sacred community to learn together, to hear from you about purpose, oh God, and the season that we are in and where you are taking us to. We thank you that you are an intentional God. We thank you that you created us with intentionality. We thank you that you created us with a purpose and a plan. We thank you, oh God, that before we were formed in our mother's womb, you knew us. God, we thank you that you created us to have impact. God, we thank you that you created us to be meaningful, oh God, not just with our lives, but in the lives of others. God, we thank you that you created us to be interdependent. God, we thank you that you created us to walk in purpose and destiny and to be who you are calling us to be. God, we thank you that you created us to make good things be visible in this society, oh God. God, we thank you that you created us to be a friend, oh God. God, we thank you that you created us to show love and kindness. God, we thank you that you created us, oh God, to demonstrate your love and your characteristics to those who are lost and those who are afraid and those who feel rejected and those who feel alone, God. We thank you that you are still speaking even now. We thank you that we serve a God who is present, a God who is loving, and a God who cares. God, we thank you that no matter what it looks like, you are still present and you are still working behind the scenes. So, God, we thank you, oh God. We thank you for your faithfulness. We thank you for your love, God. But most of all, God, we thank you that you created us for a plan and a purpose, that you created us to make meaning out of our lives, oh God, that you created us to be impactful in society and in the lives of others. So, God, we thank you. And we sign this prayer and victory, knowing that it's already done, knowing that you've already heard and responded to our prayers, knowing that you are still present with us, knowing that you are still walking and guiding us, God, knowing that you love us unconditional, knowing that all we have to do is surrender to let go and cast every care and every weight aside unto you. And God, we thank you that when we are weak, that is the right time for you to step in. For when we are weak, you make us strong, teaching us interdependence, teaching us that we need to lean on you and depend on you, God. And God, we thank you that you place others in our lives whom we can depend on. And so we sign this prayer in victory and we say, Amen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Again, thank you for tuning in on this evening. And remember to like, comment, and share. Like, comment, and share. And don't forget to be engaged and put your thoughts and your comments in the chat. What do you think about as we learn about Jonathan and David's relationship? What comes to mind when you think about relational theology? What comes up for you when I name 7 key themes that I was able to pull from my study examining 1 Samuel from chapter 13 all the way to chapter 24. And then my key text focusing on chapter 18, specifically verses 1 through 4. So put your thoughts in the chat, especially as it relates to you and your purpose and where you're at in this season, right? Can you see God? Can you experience God through others? Can you experience God through your relationships? Or who has been your destiny helper, right? Or how have you experienced God's providence, right? And even more so, how have or who have you connected with that you experience connected destiny and love and support as we continue to examine destiny focus, destiny unveiled, and connected destiny. So put your thoughts and your comments in the chat. And so this evening, again, we're going to focus on our third theme, which is connected destiny. And so the narrative of Jonathan and David, it teaches us and it demonstrates for us that the concept of connected destiny in their relationship began with their strong bond, right? It began with their mutual relationship. It began with the alignment of Jonathan being aligned with God, right? To be able to surrender himself for David, for someone else other than himself, in order that David can walk into his purpose. So from the story of Jonathan and David, we can insert again the intentionality of God. How many of us know that we serve a God who is intentional? So know that you are worthy, right? And that God created you with an intentionality. God created you with a plan and God created you for a purpose, right? Which tells me and hopefully tells you that you have worth and you have value, right? That you have worth and you have value. And I say that if you just go back and you study and you look at David, right? When he was found by Samuel, right? He was in the field, right? He wasn't who Samuel was thinking about, the prophet was thinking about when God said that God had chosen another king, right? Because he was looking at Jesse's other sons, right? But it was David, the one who wasn't present in the house. And God said, no, go him, right? And so I just want to encourage you that God is saying, no, you have worthy and you have worth. You are valuable, you are loved, and you are enough to be who God is calling you to be in this season. I don't know who that was for, but may it bless somebody. And so, as we look at the narrative of Jonathan and David, and we think of our text that we read and looked at on our last gathering, which was 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4, Jonathan's decision to bind himself with David and to form a covenant reflects more than a surface bond, right? More than an emotional bond. It was the beginning of this connected destiny that we're going to be able to examine as we study their narrative that's going to be played out. And so it signifies God's providence because God was working behind the scenes. God is the one who orchestrated the relationship, right, between Jonathan and David. And not only that, just think about it. Jonathan was the son of the current king, right? So Jonathan's relationship with his father, his bloodship, his kinship, did not stop him, right, from aligning himself with God and being obedient so that he can be who God called him to be for David, to help to prepare David and position him to walk in purpose, position David to walk in purpose and to be who God was calling David to be. And when we study the text or the story of Jonathan and David, we also know, or I want to assert, that God was speaking into the present and into the future. God was speaking into the present, speaking to Jonathan, right? But God was also speaking into the future when he spoke to Jonathan because he said who David was, right? And so because Jonathan was aligned with God, he was able to hear what God was speaking or saying, right? Relevant to who David was and who David was meant to be, right? And the impact that David was meant to make. And so Jonathan became who God needed him to be at the right time, for the right season and the right reason, in order for David to be prepared for where he was going in his future. That wasn't what it looked like then, right? So sometimes we can look at our current situation and think that God is not speaking or think that there's nothing more for us. But I just want to encourage us on this evening that God is still speaking, right? And that God has a plan and a purpose for your life. So no matter what it looks like, right? You were still created with a plan and a purpose. And so we can see that in the story and the narrative of Jonathan and David, right? So I want to encourage you to go back and read, go back and listen to the previous lesson, but also go back and read 1 Samuel for yourself, beginning at 13 to 24. And so this can signify and teach us how God is working behind the scene, and that we know when God orchestrates the relationships, because the relationships are going to be deep and meaningful and have impact. The relationship is going to encourage, support, and demonstrate love when God orchestrates the relationship. When God puts us together to experience that connected destiny so that we can make meaning and be impactful in the world and be a part of God's redemptive plan, no matter where and who God calls us to, right? So some of us are called to ministry. Some of us are called to be educators. Some of us are called to leadership in Congress or Senate, right? Some of us are called to leadership as a judge or as an attorney, right? Some of us are called to be policemen or police women. Some of us are called to be firemen and firewomen, right? So we all have a different purpose, right? But it's about being who God has called us to be and having that willingness, like Jonathan had, to be who God called him to be, right? Because Jonathan was a destiny helper. That was his purpose, right? And so God used Jonathan in his position as Saul's son in order to keep David safe and position him to his purpose, right? So I encourage you to go back and do some reading. And so, as King Saul's heir, when he was willing to give up everything, when he was willing to give his garment, his armor, and his weapons to David, it represented that he was acknowledging that David was going to be king. David was the future king, right? But it was also, or it also can symbolize his ability to be vulnerable, to relinquish everything, to be who God was calling him to be in this season, right? So his alliance, right, and his connection was with God. His focus was with God, even though he was the son of the king, helping to prepare who God has ordained as the next king, right? So it's deep and it's good. We just have to go back and study and focus on it for ourselves and to see what God is speaking to us relevant to the text. And so Jonathan was willing to give it all up in order that he can foster David to walk into his purpose, right? Which allows us to see and have some insight into the power of relationship, meaningful relationships, impactful relationships that help us to get to our purpose, that helps us to move towards our destiny, right? And so everything that Jonathan did relevant for David was to lift David up, was to encourage him, was to support him, was to protect him in order for him to get to where God needed him to go, right? Which was to become the future king. And so we can see their relationship in bold when we study the text, right? For me, it was flashing the power of their relationship, the power of the relationship, not that Jonathan only had with David, but Jonathan had to have this deep, intimate relationship with God too, in order for him to be vulnerable, give up everything, right? In order to get in position to be an ally for David, right? And so it provides us with insight into how God operates and how God will put people in our lives for the right time and the right season. Remember, it's God's timing, right? And so when you go back and you read the text, even when you look at chapters beginning at 13 to 24, David wasn't king yet, but he was going to. And when you study David's life and everything that he accomplished, you'll see that he was truly a man after God's own heart, not because he was perfect or flawless, but because it was the posture of his heart. He had a repentant heart, which was opposite and contrary to Saul, because Saul didn't have a repentant heart. Saul wasn't focused on being who God called him to be. Saul wanted to please the people. And later on, we'll learn how David wanted to please God. And that's the difference, right? But also, when we look at the connected destiny between Jonathan and David, it teaches us that David will be impactful, right? He will be impactful because, again, remember when we think in terms of connected destiny, it has to do with making impact, right? Greater impact, not just for Jonathan, not just for David, but for the nation of Israel. And we know that David was able to have a greater impact because we know who came through the lineage of David. And that's later on. And so we're able to gain insight into what it means to be impactful and powerful when we think in terms of connected destiny, right? Because God wanted David to get to the greater. God wanted David to get to who God created him to be, right? So think in terms in how David was found. He was found shepherding sheep, but God has something greater for him. the same way that God has something greater for us. So when we think about connected destiny, the premise when we look at Jonathan and David's relationship has to do with the covenant that Jonathan made with David, right? Which also serves as an example of how God uses people for God's divine purpose, for God's redemptive purpose, right? In order to have impact and greater impact in God's society and for God's people, meaning our purpose will come to fruition, right? But it's in God's timing, at the right season when God has prepared us to be and become who God has called us to be. But it also teaches us that God creates us with intentionality. I was created with intentionality, and you were created with intentionality, helping us to see the value in relationships and helping us to see the value in purpose. But it also helps us to see David and Jonathan's connection and their connected destiny that aligns with relational theology, right? Because we're able to understand how God is a present God, God is an active God, God is engaged, right, in orchestrating what we need for our life. So just because we may not see it, or just because we think God is absent, we don't serve an absent God. We serve a present God. We serve a God who continues to speak no matter what it looks like, right? No matter what we may be faced with, right? God is still present. And so we know that we serve a relational God because God connected Jonathan with David. But there was also a connection between Jonathan and God, but also David and God, right? So that we can see relationship, so that we can see interdependence, right? Meaning, I need you and you need me. David needed Jonathan and Jonathan needed David, and they both needed God, right? So full circle. So the connected destiny of Jonathan and David helps us to see the providence of God working behind the scenes and orchestrating their relationship and their deep bond. And Jonathan's ability to surrender everything for David, right? In order that Jonathan be who God created him to be as well, demonstrating that we serve a God who is intentional, demonstrating the value of community, and also demonstrating the value of relationship and being interdependent, right? Which speaks to Jonathan's ability and his purpose to get David to purpose. How Jonathan was able to encourage David, right? How Jonathan was able to speak life into David, right? And so when you go back and examine the text for yourself, just pray and ask God for revelation so you can pull out what you need for yourself in the season that you are currently in. And so meaning is not just about being connected with somebody and anyone. So we know that when God orchestrates the relationships, it's intentional. And when God orchestrates the relationship with the person who's going to lead us to destiny, it's going to be meaningful, it's going to be purposeful, right? And we will have impact. And that person who God aligns us with so that we can go to our purpose and walk in our destiny, they're going to speak life into us. They're going to encourage us. They're going to uplift us. The relationship is going to be meaningful and add value to our life. Jonathan added value to David's life, right? Jonathan encouraged David. Jonathan was willing to sacrifice everything to not only support David, but to protect David, even at the risk of whatever came from his father, who was king, right? The backlash, right? So it teaches us it matters who we're in relationship when we think in terms of connected destiny. Because sometimes we enter into relationships or we position ourselves in relationships out of familiar spirits rather than out of aligning ourselves with God and allowing God to align us to the right person or to the right people to get us to his purpose. Because how many of us know some relationships can derail our purpose because the relationships don't speak life. The relationships can hinder us. The relationships can be abusive. The relationships may not speak life into us, may not demonstrate love, right? The way that Jonathan demonstrated to David, right? And so it matters who we are in relationship. It mattered that David entered into a relationship with Jonathan at the right time when it was necessary, right? And we learned this because Samuel, when you go back and look at First Samuel, Samuel was moaning and grieving over Saul because the people wanted Saul. So God gave the people who they wanted, right? But Saul didn't align with the plan and the purpose of God. So Saul had lost his position as king. And God gave it to David, right? And so here we have Jonathan, who was the son of a king, and God used Jonathan, who was in the king's house, in order to help David get to his purpose. That's powerful, right? Which teaches us it don't matter what it looked like. God can use whoever God needs to use in order for us to get to where we need to be, despite what we may be experiencing. Because when you go back and you read the text and you study the story of Jonathan and David, you'll know that King Saul wanted David dead, right? But because Jonathan was aligned in his relationship with God, right, and knew who David was supposed to be, Jonathan was his destiny helper. And together they had a connected destiny, because when Jonathan was obedient to God, Jonathan became and walked in his purpose, rather, and to be a destiny helper, right? And because David was aligned with God, he was able to receive help and protection from Jonathan. Right. So that's why it's important for us to make sure that we are hearing from God, right? So that when God sends us the person who is going to get us to that place, right, or that position, so that we can be impactful and make meaning in the lives of others, depending on who God is calling us to. David was able to receive the help from Jonathan. David was able to receive the word of encouragement from Jonathan, right? And so that's a word of encouragement for someone on this evening. And so I believe that this connected destiny between Jonathan and David within itself was impactful because of who Jonathan was and who David was. Remember, I said David was a shepherd boy, right? They found him in the field working. And Jonathan was the son of a king. So let's look at it this way. God chose somebody who was poor and maybe marginalized, and I'm talking about David. And he chose somebody who was well off to be the destiny helper for someone who was poor and marginalized. And I'm using it in terms that maybe we can understand, right? And so we can see the greater impact that David is going to have, just because when we think in terms of how God moves and who God used in the Bible, in scripture, right? God didn't go after the people who were well off, who were wealthy, right? God used the people who were oppressed and who were marginalized, who were cast aside, who were looked at as less than, right? Because our worth and our value comes from God. And then God uses Jonathan, who was someone of prestige because he was the son of a king, to help someone who used to herd sheep take his father's position, right? That's a word. And so lastly, it teaches us, just because we don't hear God, because sometimes we don't hear God because we got too much noise, we got too many people in our ears and not the right people, right? We can think that God is not present, but God is present, and God is still speaking no matter what it looks like, right? And so David was going through, but God was still speaking. David was running, but God was still speaking, right? As David was running from King Saul because he knew that King Saul wanted to kill him. And Jonathan was willing to risk everything in order to put everything on the line in order to not just protect David, right? But also to sever the relationship with his father. When I say sever, I mean he wasn't focused on the consequences that could come out of him trying to help David, right? He was focused on David's future. And I say that because he continued to be an ally in the king's house for David, right? Which we'll learn later on how David was able to walk into his purpose, right? And so we've only covered connected destiny, which is the third theme. And so when we gather again, we will look at love and support, which is our fourth theme, right? So far we've looked at God's providence, we've looked at destiny helpers, and we looked at connected destiny on this evening. And when we meet again, I believe on August 15th, we'll examine love and support. Okay. And I want to thank you for tuning in as we continue just to uncover the power of connected destiny and what it means to be impactful and what it means to be in meaningful relationships that speak into us so that we can have or we can focus on our destiny and so that our destiny can be unveiled, meaning that we want to be in relationships that speak life into us, meaning that we want to be in environments that speak life into us, and meaning that we always want our hearts and our minds to be open so that we can hear from God and so that we can receive from God, right? And when I say receive from God, it's not about what the package looks like, right? It's about us aligning with God and becoming who God is calling us to be. So, not to focus on the person, not to focus on the title. And those of us who God has called to be destiny helpers, it's the same thing. Not to focus on the purpose, the person, not to focus on what they look like, but to focus on what God is speaking to us so that we can speak into someone else, so that we can be like Jonathan, so that we can encourage, so that we can uplift, so that we can support, and so that we can demonstrate what it means to love and be in a meaningful relationship, what it means to have a strong emotional bond, what it means to represent the characteristics of God. And so that's what Jonathan did as a destiny helper. The love that he had for David, it wasn't surface. And symbolically, when you look at the relationship in closing, when you look at the relationship between Jonathan and David, symbolically, it will be what we experience when we look at our relationship and everything that Jesus did for us, because Jesus was willing to give up his own life so that we may be saved, right? So that we may have life and have it more abundantly, so that we will be able to be in right relationship with God. That's what Jesus did, right? And I want to surmise that Jonathan, even though he is not Jesus, symbolically, he was willing to lay it all on the line for David. He was willing to give up his position as the son of the king. He was willing to give up his royal status, right? He was willing to lay it all on the line in order to be a destiny helper for David, so that David can become who God was calling him to be, right? So how many of us are in the position where we can hear from God and respond to God and be who God is calling us to be? whether that's a destiny helper speaking into someone's life, right? Whether it's speaking a word of encouragement, whether it's praying for someone, whether it's holding someone's hand and supporting someone, right? Whether it's being able to see them for who God created them to be, right? Imagine what could it have looked like for David, right? Who was in the field shepherding. And here comes a prophet to anoint him as king. Can you imagine what that must have been like for David? Pretty sure I don't think he saw himself as a king, but he was willing to leave that behind and to be and walk into what God had for him. But it's when he walked into what God had for him, he faced the adversary, right? Which was King Saul. Because King Saul knew his time was up. King Saul knew he didn't do right by God, right? And pretty sure King Saul felt when the anointing left him, when the prophet anointed David with the oil, right? Scripture tells us that the anointing left Saul and was with David. So I just want to encourage you on this evening, if you feel lost, if you feel alone, if you feel like you have no worth and no value, you do. You have worth and you have value. If things appear to be difficult and challenging, that's okay. That does not mean God won't use you, right? And I know because God used me. God used me, a mother, an unwed mother with 2 children, with 2 different fathers. God used me. God used me, a victim, a survivor of sexual abuse. God still used me, right? And God used many destiny helpers in my life at different stages to get me to where I am today. And God is still using destiny helpers in my life to continue to move me forward to go where God is calling me to. So I just want to encourage someone, and I don't know who this message is for, but I just want to encourage you on this evening to know that you are worthy and you are valuable, and that God has a plan and a purpose for your life, and that you were created intentionally by God to be used by God to help to fulfill God's divine plan and God's divine purpose, and for you to be impactful in someone's life. And so when we looked at the story of Ruth and Naomi, God doesn't waste anything, right? And so don't worry about it, what it looks like. Don't worry or focus on where you came from. I want to encourage you to focus on where God is trying to take you. All right. And again, as always, I want to thank you for tuning in. And I pray that something that I shared on this evening has been impactful in your life. I pray that it was planted on good ground, the seed that I shared in the word on today. And I pray that you are intentional about watering the seed so that you can bear much fruit. And as always, I want to thank you for tuning in to a Dr. Myrna Minute. I look forward to gathering in community with you again on Friday, August the 15th at 8 p.m. as we continue to examine Jonathan and David's connected destiny. And I want to leave you with this. Surrender to God, hear God's voice, and embrace God's plan for your life. Know that you were created for a plan and a purpose, and God desires to give you hope no matter what it looks like. And if you have any questions or you would like to reach out to me, don't hesitate to reach out to me at transform@drmyrna.com. You be blessed, enjoy your weekend, and I look forward to being in community with you again on August the 15th. Be blessed.